Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I have someone who's been on my channel before, Pragmatic Culture. We're going to talk about recent political developments and recent internet drama too. So yeah, I hope you enjoy our back and forth because I often enjoy them whenever we chat. So
Yup.
any commentary with the Singapore summit?
North Korea. We can't make any proclamations about it right now. We understand that Trump signed like some broad agreement with Kim regarding denuclearization and improved relations. Obviously, there's like a few little memes like, oh, they're gonna put up like a McDonald's or some other burger joint in there, and so the U.S. continues to be the biggest global promoter of capitalism, but or modernism, depending on how you want to put it. But
Or
other than that,
conservatism?
yeah, globalism that too. So I mean, say of it what you will. I don't think there's going to be a lot of to come out of it for at least another 2 years because I think Trump's going to look to midterms to see how well his policies thus far have worked. And I think he's going to get a mandate. Honestly, I don't see the blue wave happening, but I think that's going to dictate some of his policy going forward, both domestic and foreign. But if, depending on how things go, I could see another meeting happening in another year, possibly sooner, and turning into an ongoing series of summits with other nations as well. Because Trump has been making the rounds in terms of international relations. So it could turn into a lot of things. And I think it's helped that he sort of distanced himself from uh, traditional our traditional allies in that sense, because the United States is much more free and better off conducting these negotiations on its own than it is being held back by other superpowers who don't have our interest at heart.
About a decade ago, or more than a decade ago, these countries, or North Korea, were considered to be the axis of evil.
Mm.
Just, it is amazing how things change within a decade or so. Um,
Well, I feel like it's sort of not that it's not like everybody's saying like I've seen Reese bitch about this continually on for those who don't know, it's nightmare fuel, but he's been continually bitching about, oh, we're normalizing North Korea, oh, we're normalizing the human rights atrocities, and a lot of other leftists in the mainstream media, or establishment leftists I should say, are sort of taking up that same token and trying to make it as though that's not what negotiations are. Like, even if these negotiations weren't taking place, for one, North Korea is a nation, it's a world power of sorts, and Trump's negotiations don't really affect that. What they do, however, is make an agreement much more possible, and they do give. It does put North Korea in a much softer light, but it's not legitimizing anything. At most, it's trying to turn uh, Kim Kim Jong Un into what Stalin was during World War II, because there was a lot of American propaganda that went out to make Stalin look like, he was some angel in order to make our alliance with the communists seem much worse than it was, because the United States was still recovering from the Red Scare of the 20s. And so I think what we're seeing now is, at least in the right wing media, a sort of shift to pull that same move like FDR did with Stalin, only Trump is doing it now with Kim Jong Un. And I don't know to what degree it will be effective. I think it will. I think it'll be quite effective because I don't think the leftist media has a leg to stand on, and so it'll be successful in the campaign. Not to mention that plenty of world leaders or plenty of presidents prior to Trump have been normalizing uh, evil, axis of evil type people before him. So I think it'll work well for Trump. I think it's a smart move, and people like Reese, who are just content to bitch and moan and look for the status quo to just stay where it is and have no progress whatsoever, are just gonna get blown the fuck out, and it's not gonna be a problem.
Well, let's see. With North Korea, it's basically just a border. It's just basically a borderland to me. It's basically a client state to China and Russia to a lesser extent. So I think having like diplomatic relations between the United States is definitely making some progress. Some progress, yeah, allowing the United States having some more leeway in Asia, in Southeast Asian affairs. You know,
Yeah, definitely. The North Korea very much is to China what some of the Eastern Bloc countries were to Russia for sure, but it's been far more costly than say a Ukraine or a Poland or a Hungary was to the Soviet Union because the North Korea one isn't under the thumb of Beijing like those other Eastern Bloc countries were under the thumb of Moscow, or even countries like Belarus and Kazakhstan still are under the thumb of Moscow today. Like that relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang has just never existed. And so, as much as it's sort of been a buffer state, it's also sort of been China's little pet project trying to manage North Korea to make sure they don't get out too rurally. Because the Soviet Union never had to worry about um, any possible, like Hungary going rogue with its own nuclear weapons, or Ukraine or Poland or something like that. Like the Soviet Union didn't have to keep check on these countries in terms of international affairs because they weren't superpowers in their own right. That's different with North Korea. And of course there's also the fact that there's something symbolic about North Korea and the fact that China played a major role in the Korean War. And so there's a good bit of symbolism tied up in this. Like if there were to be a unified Korea and there would be a peace deal, it would certainly culturally be seen as a loss to China because of all the effort they put in during the Korean War and the preceding years trying to prop up North Korea in the first place. So there's a lot of levels on which the relationship between North Korea and China has been difficult, but I think China's come to the conclusion, especially now with a hardliner on defense like Trump, that it's just not worth the costs of having a rogue nation state be your borderland.
yeah, just you think maybe in the next decade or so, you think unification is possible between the Koreas? Um, because for
Uh,
me, they're genetically the Koreans are genetically the same, but North Koreans are shorter. They pretty much share the same IQ. I think liberalism or liberal democracy is definitely going to be more suited for those type of people. Or
I don't know because I think culturally speaking, what communism was able to do in Europe and East Asia under sort of Maoism and Stalinism was there was a heavy binding of nationalism and communism together to the point where the two are seen as inseparable now. And you will not have North Koreans give up that cultural identity in that way. And that's one of the things that's very lacking in these sort of globalist nations like Japan and like South Korea is there's a strong lack of national identity, even if it's not to the extent that it is in Western democracies like the UK and the United States. It's still there. Like globalism has that effect wherever it touches. And so North Koreans are not going to give that up in the slightest. Like there's still going to be that Juche mentality going on. And on top of that, there's the fact that there's just been such a long period where, uh, well, just to go back to the cultural issue, North Koreans are going to be disgusted by South Korean culture. There's no other way to put it. And I
yeah,
think,
consumerist culture essentially.
yeah, and I think if you have a democratic nation come to power, you're going to see very different parties. You're going to see what sort of end up going to be a pseudo Maoist, possibly, party emerge that's very traditionalist and very left wing. And you're going to see like the traditional South Korean sort of more liberal parties sort of emerge. I have no clue about Korean politics, so I don't know if there's any I don't know their parties. I don't know if there's already parties like that in there, or if it's possible that such parties would emerge. That's just my very, very surface level assessment. But it seems likely that there's going to be a strong traditionalist faction, and simply because of the way the North Korean culture is, that traditionalism is going to be tied in with a very hard line leftist attitude as well. And so the democracy of a united Korea would be very, very unstable, not just from, the cultural standpoint, but there's also going to be economic ramifications too. If there's some try attempt at a mixed economy like what China was doing, because it's just it's going to be very hard to manage because you already have the South that's been globalized and turned into a capitalist hellhole.
Yeah. And I think the same thing is sort of happening in East Germany because East Germany still have like many radical elements due to the fact they were under the thumb of the Soviet Union. Um, like they're like one of the more radical. They have more radical parties in East Germany and their German parliament. Um, just, just they're not really used to. Despite like nearly 2 decades of being unified, like East Germany still have like very strong sympathies to the culture that they're in, and just it's very interesting. It's a very interesting developments in Germany.
Yeah, it has been, and you can sort of see it in how they manage themselves now, where um, it was pointed out actually when Croughton T, before he went crazy, actually pointed out a while ago that the people they have now as sort of like their like social media chancellor, or the one who sort of looks over all the social media posts and the internet and that hate speech kind of thing, is actually a former member of the Stasi. And the Stasi was the KGB, essentially, was the KGB in Eastern Germany. They're very much responsible for getting family members to spy on each other, for getting, just neighbors to spy on each other. They destroyed relationships and ruined families because of how interwoven the spy network was in East Germany. And so I know this because I have family in Berlin. When the wall finally came down and there was this unification, there was actually a list put out of people who were spies. And it ended up being something like, I don't want to say close to half because I don't think it was that high. I think it was something like a sixth or a fifth of every person in East Germany was a spy or an informant. And so essentially what you had was 1 in 6 or 1 in 5 people was an informant. So family members, neighbors, all that sorts of things. And when people found out, it destroyed relationships, it destroyed lives, and some people just chose not to look out of fear that it would ruin their relationship. And so there's still, some people who don't know if their neighbors were spying on them or not. But that's sort of the relationship I could see being maintained in a North Korea, where it's still very sort of hardline, and those elements end up getting integrated into the democracy in different ways than initially suspected. Because she's not the German chancellor, not the German chancellor, not Merkel, but some other woman who's in Merkel's office at the moment, who's like in charge of policing hate speech in Germany. She's not the only Stasi hire that the German federal government has made, who's in a position of high power. Like they hired a lot of former Eastern German Stasi, and they hired a lot of former informants and things like that. Not simply because 1 in 6 people just happen to be informants, but they did seek these people out in the same way that other people in the past have sought these people out for like their efficiency or their knowledge in a certain area. And so you'd see a weird sort of authoritarian integration into that democracy. And it's weird because the way it's being used isn't like it's being used in the Soviet Union. It's not like, this is being used to violently suppress media or riots or something like that. It's a very soft form of censorship, like going after Facebook, and it's in a way that's made palatable by saying, oh, it's hate speech against immigrants, you got to watch the Nazis and stuff like that. But North Korea and the Koreas, if they were to unite, wouldn't have that history. They don't have that history of guilt that the West sort of has, and so it would be interesting to see how South Koreans reacted to a push of authoritarian measures against them. I would
I don't
make
know.
me
I don't know, with the Koreans, I've been told, I heard somewhere that they kind of prefer that type of soft authoritarianism in their countries, like,
Yeah, well, that wouldn't surprise me too much. It's sort of one of the things I'm reading. I haven't read Hegel directly, but I'm reading a lot of secondary sources, and one of them I have by Clark Butler is actually sort of the way he's choosing to break down Hegel is to sort of follow his story of the philosophy of history and go from country to country to country and talk about how each element of Hegel's philosophy is integrated into his view of those nations that he talks about in philosophy of history. And one of the things Hegel actually brings up is that the Orient is the home of sort of this despotism, where in the early Chinese days, or you had the emperor deified as the god, and his rule was tied into whether or not he could sort of stave off natural disasters and keep the land bountiful and keep the people happy. And should a natural disaster happen, it was seen that the emperor was no longer God or was never really God. There'd be violent revolution, and it was a very weak grounds on which the despotism was based. But that made each ruler more hardline and more despotic, so that if something like that were to happen, they would try to prevent another uprising. And so I think there's a lot of truth in that, where the East just has this culture that is not very prone to a sort of freedom that the West is used to. The ideas of liberalism that the early Christians talked of, or especially in the Protestant Reformation, like John Calvin, who would later go on to influence John Locke, that sort of philosophy is completely lacking in the East. And as such, I could see the South Koreans being somewhat docile to it if it did sort of take over, but I could never. I'd have to see some clashes because eventually it would start to affect the economic front. And as we've seen with China and Hong Kong, when China can be the de facto ruler of Hong Kong for as long as it likes, so long as the people aren't feeling any harsh economic consequences. But the more Beijing has encroached on Hong Kong, the worse it's gotten for the people of Hong Kong, and that's when we've started to see protests. And if there were to be some sort of coup of former North Korean bigwigs within a united Korean democracy, I could see a lot of people in major areas like Seoul and just former capitalists who enjoyed a much higher standard of living sort of revolting against this North Korean style takeover.
yeah, just like, yeah, hypothetical unification of Korea. I would imagine that the South Korea would have spent like a lot of money, like maybe like I don't know how much a yen is worth. Is that their currency, yen or yuan?
I forget one of those two,
I
but
don't know. I want to make a racist joke, but I cannot think of it. Let's just say yen. But it seemed like it would take a lot of money to integrate the North Koreans into their economies. As the same thing with East Germany. I think West Germany spent about somewhere between $100 million in USD alone on East Germany. Maybe even more. I could be wrong on that.
I don't see. I just looked it up. The yuan is Chinese and the yen is Japanese, so I don't know what the South Korean. I think the South Koreans just have South Korean dollars. I think that's what it is. But um, yeah, I don't see that being. That's another thing. The one of the articles I was sent an article by comrade Pierre Trudenk, I think, either him or one of his followers, about the trouble that North Koreans have integrating into the South Korean society. And a lot of that is because of a cultural animus. Like, South Koreans view North Koreans as inferior, even though genetically speaking, they're pretty much the same. And so there's a heavy, heavy bias against North Koreans. Like, you go to South Korea, you're hated intensely. And that one of the things that the West has that the East doesn't, again, is this sort of leftover of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and the East just completely lacks that. And so there'd be a lot of cultural animus again. Even if it were to be politically unified, there would be a cultural divide that would last I would say at least a century, if not more, simply because there's not that sort of forgive and forget mentality among Eastern people.
Yeah. Speaking, okay, on Eastern people, let's move to the Middle East now. Let's talk about the withdrawal of the Iran deal. After doing more research and talking to some few good people I trust on this matter, I consider that withdrawing from the Iran deal was a mistake. For a very long time, I sort of just accepted the neoconservative narrative that the Iran deal was just bad because it threatened interest in Israel, all that mess. Just then I
Mhm.
realized that many people took, well, like I say, a more Zionist perspective on the Iran deal. The Iran deal really benefited Europe. It really benefited Europe. This is why they were so worried about this withdrawing from the Iran deal to the U.S. because they were getting a lot of their energy from Iran. Now they're going to be more dependent on Russia for their energy, like oil. Like specifically, Germany, I think, has an interest in Russian oil. Um, but that's a different topic. But yeah, I just think the Iran deal was a withdrawing from the Iran deal was a mistake. It also hurt the United States' reputation on this too a little bit. Like it basically detailing you cannot trust the United States on anything, including the deal. And this
I
also in Iran, the domestic politics also sparked more anti-American sentiments within the Iranian government too.
Yeah. So I would agree that this was a bad look for America, at least in Iran, and globally too, because a lot of superpowers liked it. I don't happen to think it's a big deal though, because I don't think we should give a shit about what Europe thinks about us or what other Western powers think about us, because they're all dependent on us for our military anyway. So if they're so concerned about Iran getting nukes, the EU can strike up its own deal, and Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Although I shouldn't throw the Anzacs into this; they're rather quiet on this issue. But the EU can negotiate its own deal if it's really that concerned. And honestly, I think the biggest deal was that this was a bad deal, undoubtedly, when Obama made it. Like, it wasn't really going to stop progress. I know Netanyahu fearmongers about this all the time, that, Iran's this close to getting nukes. And he's not wrong. They're going to build nukes. Like, you'd have to be stupid to say Iran isn't going to build nukes. But I think the real issue isn't that they're going to build nukes, more so that it's not going to be more so that we wanted to see their hand. So the takes I've sort of seen on this have been that the deal was bad, but it was made intentionally bad by Obama because it would be easy to violate and there was no enforcement. And so when Trump or whoever his predecessor was wanted to pull out of the deal, there could be some sort of like way of checking and some way of justification. Like, all right, well, if you want us to stay in the deal, let's make sure this deal is actually legit. Let us check X, Y, and Z. And it would show how far along Iran's actually come in building nuclear weapons and what they're specifically doing. And if Iran refused, it would just give us more grounds to break off the deal. And so, one way or another, Iran would be showing its hand on how far along it's actually come with nuclear weapons, or at least nuclear weapons grade uranium. And so, because of that, Trump pulling out, I don't think is a bad move, because I think it was a bad deal, and I think Obama made this deal from a place of weakness fundamentally. And so I think, at least for domestic politics, it was a good move because it makes us look stronger. Internationally, who gives a fuck? The rest of the world will bend to our will anyway. It's not like their opinions matter. And honestly, I think
I'm sorry.
no. I was just gonna say, I think if we wanted to negotiate a better deal, we could. But I think it'd have to be similar to North Korean style denuclearization, honestly. And I think it'd be easier to do that with Iran than it would be to do with a North Korea, because I think we could sort of play up our I think we could sort of play up different relationships in terms of trade and in terms of lifting embargoes. Like we have a lot of leverage. It'll be far easier to talk about what we could do for Iran than what we could do for North Korea, because the most of the world isn't even that opposed to. Well, I shouldn't say they're not that opposed to Iran, but what I mean is that people are open to striking more deals in the Middle East because there's economic gain for everybody involved, especially when it comes to OPEC nations and things like that and who holds the cards. So I think it'll be easier to strike up a deal with Iran that's actually beneficial, and it will actually stop their nuclear ambitions in their tracks. And I think it's going to be a better look for America when it makes that deal. And I think other nations can go fuck off if they're honestly concerned about how reliable we are with peace treaties. Because as of now, we're still in NATO. We're still the ones essentially who are going to be coming to Europe's defense if Russia were to ever regain a significant amount of military ambition. So if the rest of the world were really that concerned, there'd be more of a ruckus over it, or there'd at least be they wouldn't just be whinging about it and fading away like they have done. This is all just political posturing on their part.
Just on our more on Iran is just it just seemed like it's just more so like petty power politics because they're not going to play ball with the United States of America. They're not going to embrace that. At least the Iranian government are not going to embrace liberalism anytime soon. But Iran is extremely complex society, domestically speaking. But on an international stage, they they spout too much. They spout too much anti-Zionist rhetoric. This is probably called the main cause of Israel. The Israeli fears about Iran, although that fear may be unjustified, but I just think you said something about Obama saying coming from a place of weakness. I think more so came from a place of naivete because I don't think Obama wasn't a ex. I think Obama was a poor statesman, a poor president, domestically speaking, but it just seems like it more so came from a place of naivete, just pure negotiation from from Iran, at least from a more neoconservative perspective on this, the more neoconservative narrative about the Iran deal. But can we really get a better deal with Iran, though?
Absolutely, I would say, because I think people are going to want in on a deal, and I think the EU lives largely vicariously through our military and through our military deals. Like they don't have the military presence we do in the Middle East. They don't have the relationship of helping out Middle Eastern factions when it comes to them. Like we're the big proppers up of various coups and various other factions when it comes to Syria, when it came to overthrowing people in Afghanistan, and all those sorts of things. And so we are the person you have to go through if you want something done in the Middle East, at least for the Western world, which is the EU. And so undoubtedly, if we wanted to make a deal, the EU would get in on it, even if the terms were real shitty. And they'd want to get in on it too, because the terms wouldn't just be that of denuclearization, militarily speaking. It'd be in terms of allowing greater access to resources, lifting embargoes or sanctions or what have you. And it would be a very beneficial deal for all parties involved because it would allow the greater exportation of what Iran has. It'd allow for pre-revolution standards of life to return to Iran. And I think that'd be a big thing too, because I know the major obstacle at this point to us striking a deal isn't so much international interference. It's really Iran's hatred for the U.S., but I think that's easily ameliorable. Like, we have pretty good standings with fair portions of the Middle East, despite our alliance with Israel. And I don't think Iran is going to choose that to be the hill to die on, especially when other nations are fine with it and we're working with them and we're working with Israel simultaneously. So I think Iran is smart enough, or possibly its leaders will be smart enough to understand that it's still good to work with us, even if we're allied with whatever derogatory name they have for Israel. So I think even though the toughest issue is going to be Iran's own spite for us, it's not certainly not going to be impossible to overcome.
That's the thing. That's the thing with Israel, though. They definitely don't want Iran to be in power, though. That's the thing. That's the thing. That's the tricky thing about Israel because they really shown a great fear about Iran. And I also think they've been rather caustic to United States relations to other Middle Eastern countries due to their rather borderline xenophobia against other nations due to the fact they are a Jewish state and they are universally hated in that region of the world. So I think they're definitely gonna hinder process due to the fact that Israel is a strategically important
Yeah.
ally to the United States of America.
Well,
Uh,
I think one of the things you're right. With Israel, I think it comes down to Iran pulling back from its support of Hezbollah a little bit, because Iran and Lebanon have always been tight allies, and Iran has always exported weapons and things like that to Lebanon in support of Hezbollah and the various other militant anti-Israel factions within the Lebanese politics. There was that brief spat I remember recently that Lebanon had with, like, it was like a minor civil war or something. There was a coup because somebody died somewhere else and there was some sort of uprising. I forget the exact circumstances. I should probably look it up again. But like there's Lebanon is Israel's real concern is the fact that Lebanon is a proxy state for Iran and they happen to be supporting Hezbollah. I mean, I don't think that's an issue that is insurmountable either though, because while we were fighting, I forget which war it was, but we were working with Iraq, I think at the time, and Iraq was just lobbing missiles at Israel for a great period of time. And we told Israel, hey, don't fire shit back at them while we're trying to work with them right now. And Israel just kind of put up with it. And so if they were able to put up with another nation essentially committing acts of war against them, not even covertly, I think we could convince Israel to just say, you know, calm your tits, we're making this deal. And you'll end up having the same relationship with Iran that you currently have with Saudi Arabia. Because, you know, Israel and Saudi Arabia enjoy somewhat of an interesting relationship at the moment, being proxies of the United States. And so adding another proxy to that list, I don't think would be impossible. Because again, Israel is one of those states where obviously there's a little bit more of an interplay because of the Zionist influence in the United States, APAC, and things like that. But I think if you have a continued wave of populism like we have with Trump, I don't think it's impossible to tell Israel to just, you know, shut the hell up.
yeah, just like United States is still a world hegemon, still a superpower in that sense, and we definitely do have the power to treat Israel as a regular client state. Like we're gonna, like they have the chance to cut them off anytime that they want to. Um, that's always going to be a factor. But the thing is, Israel, our other client states do receive special treatment for from the United States. That's sort of just going to be like always going to be a factor into that when dealing with Israel with these Middle Eastern conflicts. And it just seemed like my main problem with Israel is they're often a target for Middle Eastern terrorism. That's sort of just the thing due to the fact they're a Jewish state. They're always going to need that type of protection, or at least from a different point of view. Anyway, just
Yeah, because of their status as a uniquely Jewish state for Jews, it's always going to get in the way. But one way or another, to the extent that people say they're the tail that wags the dogs in relation to our relation in terms of our relationship to them, that's only somewhat true. Because at the end of the day, like we may never stop funding Israel, but Obama got away with a lot of shit that Netanyahu was not happy with, that Israelis at large weren't happy with, and I think Trump is capable of doing the same because he's provided even more lip service to Netanyahu and Israel in general than Obama had. So he's already in a good enough standing with them to use some of the political capital and make a sort of deal like this. Obviously, Israel's going to kvetch about it, but there's only so much they can do, and there's only so much they could whine about if whatchamacallit, they want to continue to enjoy the benefits of being our client state.
Yeah. Also, other more other interesting developments in Europe, especially in the Mediterranean area. Italy, the first Eurosceptic government in the EU. Although I think most Eastern Europeans definitely have like anti-European EU sentiments, but just Italy just elected
Oh yeah,
this government.
Italy's the first Eurosceptic nation in a while within the EU.
Yeah, just that's going to be real interesting to see what's going to
Mm.
happen. Just to see this Eurosceptic government.
Yeah, admittedly, I'm not up to date with what happened about, like, I know two major right wing parties got in. I know one is Five Star, and I forget the name of the other big party that ended up forming the coalition. But I think Lega, which is sort of like, uh, I don't know if they were the openly neo-fascist party or not, but they were another big right-wing party, and they got in on the coalition. And the one other party whose name I can't think of, and they apparently have a prime minister right now who's incredibly anti-immigration, very Eurosceptic, and I know it looks good. I'm just worried about Italians being Italians because I don't know how long it's gonna last.
Oh no, I think Italians definitely have a more stronger sense of nationalism than other European nations. They still have they're still a very traditional culture as far as I can tell. Like due to the fact for one, they're deeply religious as a people, go Catholics, I guess. Um, just it'd be rather interesting what's going to happen in the upcoming months. Right now, some people I follow on Twitter are worried about this due to Russian influence spreading into Europe further due to the first Eurosceptic government, because Putin has publicly declared multiple times that he's against the EU, he's against NATO, and he says people are just sort of just worried about Russia influence spreading spreading to Italy, and some people may even advocate for keeping subverting Italian democracy because of this. Um,
I mean, this is pretty typical leftist kvetching at this point, but I think who's someone who knows a pretty good deal about this stuff is Ray, actually, and I've been meaning to talk to her about it because supposedly she's done some convincing of academic agent of like the Russian influence within the Trump campaign and things like that, and so I'd look to her opinion on that somewhat because I think
yes.
there's certainly some. Sorry.
Oh, she will. Oh, she will agree with me on that because I did talk to her about this a while ago.
What did you agree on exactly?
Like about Russian influence spreading into Italy. Like I think she will definitely agree on that because she's really anti-Russian.
Oh no,
I'm
look,
sort
I think this
of.
gets misunderstood a lot. I'm not pro-Russian. I know it comes off that way when I talk about, well, I don't believe their influence is this great. Like, I despise Russians with a passion, and so part of it's a bias because I'm part Ukrainian, but the other part of it is that I just look at the history of the Russian people, and they're this weird abortion of Eastern and Western culture where it's sort of like supposed to be Western traditionalism, like orthodoxy and such, but it's us or the spiritual, to use very Hegelian terms, the spiritual sort of despotism of the early European empires that was embodied in sort of the old Hebraic God and eternal father figure type patriarch. And then there's the Oriental despotism of the East, which is more less of a spiritual nature and more of a government nature, where again it's like the leader is sort of the god figure. And Russia is where both of those things come to rest. It's not like you have a king in the West that's ordained by God, even though you had some of that in early Russian history. Communism kind of did away with that. Now it's sort of like you have these god emperor type political figures with this mentality of hyper strict having to hyper bleh, I can't talk, having to conform to these narrow, rigid traditions that have been warped by communistic worldview as well. It's so Russia. I despise. Long story short, Russia is a people who are content with despotism in all forms, and rather than try to fix it for themselves, they just choose to export it so everybody can be miserable with them. And I would like nothing more to see Russia just completely stop existing. But I just don't. I believe the extent to which their political influence is stated is highly over exaggerated. Because really, when people say Russia is a third world nation with first world weapons, that's a completely accurate statement. Because you still have people over there grave robbing in order to get food. You still have people over there living in crap living conditions. It's still like the economic state of the late Soviet Union. And it's the culture hasn't improved either. Like they haven't embraced a sort of Western traditionalism of embracing God. They're like they have abortions out the wazoo. They have drug problems to unparalleled degrees. Like the shit that goes on in the city of Omsk would make Detroit look like a fucking New York City under Giuliani. It's insane. But all of that put aside, I
Oh,
just don't think. Uh, I don't like Russians, but I
oh,
don't think the fear of Russia that we currently have is justified in any sense. And so I'd like to understand, like, yeah, I could understand there could be some Russian actors within the Trump campaign, but in the same way, I'm sure there were other foreign actors inside of Hillary Clinton's campaign. I'm sure there were other types of foreign nationals within both campaigns because every nation in the world has a stake on how the US election turns out. And so, of course, every nation with the capabilities is going to try to infiltrate both campaigns if they can, or hedge their bets on one campaign over the other. And if Russia happened to hedge their bets on the right campaign, well, kind of good on them. But at the same time, just because there's a few bad actors within the Trump campaign doesn't mean that Trump's success or that the Trump's success or the direction of policy in the United States is being directed by the Russians. They just happen to place their bet on the right horse more so.
mm, I got a rather mixed view on Russia. One, I'm not Ukrainian. I'm African American, so I have no
Yeah,
real.
you don't have that ethnic bent like I do.
I don't have no real connection to Eastern European culture or European culture in general. I'm just more of a destination. I'm just more of a weird breed of American and Afro culture. You can, but on my view on Russia, my personal view on Russia, I just feel bad for them because they've just been screwed. They run their country like a mafia state for centuries, and when things started getting a little bit better with Peter II, but things just started just going downhill. But the thing is, like
Yeah,
during the
like
late 18th century, not late 18th century, but the late 19th century, things just started to improve slowly, like very slowly, but it was progress. Like the economy was
yeah,
just slowly.
that that's what I mean. It's like Russia is a state that cannot get its shit together at any point. There's always been this massive gap between the high and the low, with an almost non-existent middle in terms of like the class and hierarchical structure of the nation and the people. There's always been this sort of lack of nuance, I guess is the only way to put it, in Russian politics, where it's always been straightforward and direct, which has been to their benefit recently, especially in the Obama era, because Obama was a pussy. But it's always been something where it's so black and white with Russians, where it's either this way or it's that way, and it's constantly been going between despotism and almost like anarchy in some sense, because it's almost like anarcho tyranny, where it's like the punishment of the good for because they can't really punish the evil, because there is still evil in that country, but it's run in much the same way Italy was. And that's to get back to Italy, which is what we started talking about. That's my fear about Italy. Italy is a state riddled with corruption and riddled with globalists who would benefit just as much from illegal immigration as some globalists in the U.S. would from Mexican immigration. And
Um,
as such, I don't see. I'm happy to see, and Italians being Italians, most of them don't give a crap as long as they get to live their lives and they get to drink wine and eat food soaked in olive oil and or tomato sauce. So I it's sort of like I can see the coalition working and I can see the coalition effective if the Italian people have actually effectively culturally become homogenous again. But barring that, I don't see anything great. Like if Italy manages to leave the EU, then all bets are off. Good for them. They can go fucking collapse after that. But I don't know if they'll even get that far, which is my real concern. And if that's and to talk about Russia influence, if they leave the EU because of Russia, then fine, good on Russia. Like if Russia's doing all the things I want them to do, then I'm not going to bitch and moan about Russia, quite frankly, even if it is their fault and even if they are doing other things, because they're still going to be irrelevant on the global scale. Like the United States is in a cold war with China right now, and I don't understand all this fear mongering about Russia because Russia isn't colonizing Africa, or Russia isn't manipulating our currency currently. Russia isn't profiting massively off of subsidized steel at the expense of American industry. Like, Russia is a non player in so many important areas right now that I can't possibly imagine why there's all this kerfuffle over them, except as a scapegoat for the emergence of right wing politics in Europe and the United States. So I think it's wholly reasonable to completely just ignore that Russia even exists at this stage of the game.
okay, on Russia though. Russia do have a stake in everything. Well, not everything. They have a stake of stealing their national. They have a stake of stealing your energy, their oil. So there's always going to be that interest. Germany have an interest in Russia because they want their energy. They're willing to pay for their energy. That's sort of just like right now, Russia out of this moment is always in a state of survival, internationally speaking, domestically speaking, because Russia is a very diverse society. And right now, internationally speaking, they want to further interest as much as they can, i.e., selling their oil. They nationalized their oil industry for a reason to get that out there. Right now, due to this pushback from the United States, they're going to be more dependent on China. So they're probably going to be crippled by China because as of right now, the Chinese and Russian relationship is abysmal since the Sino-Russian split during the 1950s or during the Korean War. So it just I don't fear Russia. I feel bad for them. Just I rather have a I don't know. I have a rather some type of respect for their leaders, to be honest, for keeping a large country with very diverse people in line like that. That takes a lot of cunning and will to do that. Just
Yeah, so like Russia has a stake and Russia's trying to get into the global market for the sake of oil and so that they can be relieved from this disastrous economy which they've been facing since basically the entire Soviet Union, but in particular the late Soviet Union under Gorbachev and Glasnost and Perestroika and things like that. But at the end of the day, uh, that's not go what they're talking about right now. What Russia's trying to do to alleviate that, which is sort of go along with sort of this populist wave and work with what the right's doing, because the right has arguably more pro-Russian sentiment than anyone in the left does at the moment. At the end of the day, that's still harmless, because if Russia enters the global market again, it's going to take them another half a century to get back on their feet to even have close the influence they had during the Soviet Union. Like they're no longer the subversive force they once were, where they can send billions and billions of dollars into spy networks or into funding academics who are going to actively subvert, or even unions that are going to actively subvert culture. Like Russia doesn't even gain from that in particular anymore. So all of the destructive things that Russia once did as a superpower in the form of the Soviet Union would be unhelpful at best and counterproductive to their own goals at worst, or even the norm, I would say. And so what I think is going to happen is if Russia enters the global stage, they're going to be a non-player still, or well, they've entered the global stage, so obviously they're a player, but they're not going to be China. At the end of the day, China is still what we're worrying about. With their soft colonization, with their manipulation of currency, with their market effect right now, everything is tied into China. China is the economic and military power to worry about, whether it's their expansion in the South China Sea, whether it's what they're doing to the dollar. I'm repeating myself at this point, but again, Russia entering the global stage is a neutral thing. It's not going to spell any disaster for any portion of Europe because even if the United States were to pull out of NATO, Europe could still hobble a defense together that would be enough to stave off the Russians because the Russians are still working off of like 50s and 60s tech. Their army is so trash. It's unbelievable. And like Russia isn't a Middle Eastern nation. I still believe that mutually assured destruction is a thing with them. And so we can pretty much take their nuclear arsenal off the table. It's just I'm still baffled why we concern ourselves with Russia, but I know the left's doing it as a scapegoat. But I don't see them entering the global stage anytime soon. And if they do, I can't see the negative downsides of it.
On China, on the big Chinese question, or China, and I mean, I wish. What's the derogatory word for China people?
Chinks.
All right. On the chink question, on the yellow people question, on the short people question, the short round question, Indiana
Short
Jones
round question.
reference. Yeah, the on China though, there's a realist out there named John Mishemer, and he said if economic growth remains the same, and they're definitely going to be a threat. Basically, people like Patrick Buchanan, Mishemer, and many other foreign policy realists will say that America Pax Americana, or the unipolar world, is coming to an end, and we're returning to a multipolar world. And people like Mishemer will say that you're going to be the United States, Russia as a very weak superpower, and China. So they're going to be competing in this new multipolar world for a while.
Yeah. So go on. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
So we have no idea what this multipolar world is going to look like unless we look at history during the 19th century. That was definitely a multipolar world where we have like competing empires. There's sort of like this balance of power thing. And for a very long time, I think, due to the fact we live under a unipolar parity, I think we have abandoned balance of power politics for a very long time since the end of the Cold War. So it's going to be really interesting if we do return to a multipolar world during our lifetimes.
Yeah, well, obviously, and I don't think it's going to be a multi-power world with the United States as the global hegemon still. Like China's influence is obviously extending into Africa again, and we're going to have to balance that there. We also have to worry about the South China Sea, of course, and all those interests there. But I don't, one way or another, like unless the United States were to retreat into complete isolationism, at least speaking in terms of foreign policy, it's just not going to. China isn't going to be what the U.S. and Britain once were, or what the United States is right now. And Russia, at the end of the day, given to the fact that they have a horrible relationship with China, is probably going to be looking to where it can actually make a buck, which is in the West, and try to, like, raise its standard of living at least somewhat. And so at the end of the day, you have Russia, who is the third power in this sort of weekly tripolar world that we're eventually going to be able to court because they have no prospects in China whatsoever, and their relationship isn't going anywhere. So we have two of the three world powers for the next century who are essentially going to be at least loosely aligned with Western interests. And as for China, we can employ a sort of containment policy on them. That was a lot of the people I've heard say, a lot of people I listen to say TPP was sort of a rough containment policy, because what it was designed to do is to stave off China's military ambitions by allowing them access to all these different markets and allowing them greater influence in the WTO, and through that making sure that they decrease their expansion of sort of client states. And I think we can pursue measures like that. I think we can also afford not direct military confrontation, but I don't think it would be hard to at least bolster our allies and form something of an ASEAN military union in the same way we have NATO now for the purpose of containing China. Like, we still have a lot of options on the book that we haven't considered yet. Obviously, things grow massively more complicated because obviously we are economically bound to China, and so we can't afford to play too much because they can always call our debt, they could stop buying debt, they could do shit to our currency. So it's a weird situation, but we've managed to maintain fairly good relationships with China for a long time, even while they've been sort of doing all this shit. And so I think we could easily make the case that our actions are justified in light of what China's been doing. So I don't think it's impossible to contain China, and I don't think. And because of the way the geopolitical stage is set right now, with how many nations there are, and being that the fact that there really isn't room for competing empires, as you put it, I think I think there are a lot of easy ways to contain what could be described as sort of a red empire.
Yeah. Also, speaking of red, speaker than red. Any thoughts on this internet drama with our autistic furry ANCAP?
Oh, do we want to get into the SO drama?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't. I don't know what he's on about. I don't know why he's accusing leftists of doxing them. I haven't had a particularly good experience with what's his name, Batco. Even though I'm subscribed to him, he kind of annoyed me on Twitter, and so he muted me, so I just stopped following him if he wasn't going to respond to me. But I still thought the video he did was good. I liked the video he did in response to Prager, but Esso's just being a bitch, trying to remain relevant. When his first channel got ganked, it had far more subs than it does now, and he's never going to be able to achieve that amount of subs again, I think, because he was still doing sort of very basic bitch anti-SJW type stuff, and the popularity of that has passed. So at this point, it's pretty much going to be Esso clinging at the vestiges of what were his moderate popularity beforehand. And this is just another attempt at that. Like, this is the last gasp of a drowning person, pretty much.
Drowning person. He was intellectually embarrassed by a troll Tom. He was caught in a lie by other ANCAP YouTuber called Jim Jesus about him deleting comments. Now he's claiming that leftists, small-time leftist YouTubers, by the way, create a doxing server, and he's in trouble with some guy called ANCAP Chick. Yes.
Well, it's like the chick. Now, Esso claimed that when he sent that message, he was just clarifying something that you said in a conversation prior to ANCAP Chick joining. Is that true?
No, it's not true.
So you weren't saying something stupid, and then Esoteric Entity wasn't just giving her the gist of the conversation.
No, that wasn't what happened, because One, one, I probably would never say something like that in the same vein of esoteric. And two, I'm the two. It's the bananas that screenshotted that. He was there. He was there when he said that to ANCAP chick. So we both know that he's lying. In fact, he kicked me after this after his server. He kicked me out of his server after I said he was the nightmare fuel of his community. Um, and so
That's pretty. That's pretty funny.
I'm surprised he didn't kick it to the bananas because he's the one that was insinuating that he was a pedophile. Just, just.
Yeah. Well, I don't
So
know.
yeah,
I
covering. This is just damage control. He just his and his click just sort of just view me as low cal. So yeah,
yeah.
just so yeah, he just used that as an excuse, and people who are not part of his clique know that he's lying. He just know that this was outright farce.
Yeah. Like Batko said in his video, it doesn't make sense that he's just waiting until July to release supposed information about a docs. Like, why he wouldn't release it now is dumb. Because if it's clear evidence that that doesn't need vetting of a doxing server, you can just release it, and there shouldn't be a problem. But I think we know that Esoteric doesn't exactly have that record of spotless behavior.
Yeah, man. It's just sort of just like just it's just sort of like how he's acting in this. He's just acting very shady. Just so very shady, like just covering his tracks and doing it. He's honestly doing it Clinton style. Like there's a trail of this. There's always going to be a trail with this type of farce. Honestly, just guy.
Yeah, it's like I think what I'm trying to get out of Esso is like I don't think Esso quite gets the fact that it's over for him and over for I think ANCAPs in general. Like I think ANCAPs and libertarians sort of had a moment, but I think the only libertarians that are even going to be really relevant espousing a particularly libertarian viewpoint are people like Freedom Tunes, who are sort of like libertarian capitalists who lean more conservative and as such can kind of play to like the Steven Crowder type audience and that sort of thing. And they also have like an animated thing to it, which is nice. But people like Shane Killian and Esoteric Entity and Mr. Dapperton, who are explicitly sort of pushing the ANCAP libertarian type thing, I don't see much of a future for them. Like maybe some people like guys like My Two Cents who broaden their horizons a little bit more have something going for them, but I don't know. I just don't see it for them continuing. I mean, Dapperton's a channel with over 100,000 subscribers. He's still growing, admittedly, but they're all on borrowed time. IMO.
Just on the state of libertarianism, I think at this point only academics, actually real libertarian academics, are just going to receive some type of spotlight. I think Tom Woods is becoming more popular. Still like him. I still like his content because it's often informative and just. Well, for one, he's like a very charming guy. Like he's a very nice guy.
Yeah, like the more intellectual libertarians like Tom Woods and Hans Hermann Hoppe and those type of people, like even people from the Mises Institute and some folks from Cato possibly, are going to maintain a little bit more influence and relevance than people who haven't, people who don't have that prowess. Like people like Esso and Dapperton and Shane Killian aren't adding intellectually to the libertarian thought pool. If anything, there's a track.
Although Shane Killian has definitely have more potential than those two.
Yeah, I don't know. someone who I think is he's a
I know
science.
you're still kind of mad after he called you a racist and just
It's fucking stupid because he's a libertine and he's the Tuckerite and it's dumb. Like he doesn't really have anything particular to offer. Like he has his credentials as a scientist, which he kind of flashes in people's faces and makes it out to be like it affects his opinions on libertarianism or logic or things like that. Like I guess you could say he's read theory, so to speak, but it's not anything new. Like his video on logic was bad. His video on borders is bad. His video on immigrations is bad. It's all really tired libertine bullshit that most people at this point don't buy into because they recognize that the state isn't simply a function of material reality. It's a function of people's psychological projections on structures of authority and why they need it and why they need to be told what to do and how humans defer violence onto other forces so that they're able to engage in more productive activities. But it's like, it's this really pseudo intellectual mask that Shane Killian uses and that Esso tries to co opt from him, sort of, that is gonna eventually get the rug pulled out from underneath him. Like, see, I didn't get the one thing I didn't get about the video that Batco did was why he included Dapperton, because this other all Dapperton has been implicated in is that Dapperton would supposedly get this information and then he'd supposedly share it. But I don't think he showed screenshots of Dapperton actually saying that. I just think he showed screenshots of esoteric entities saying that he would give it to Dapperton. But
I,
Dapperton, I don't, as far as I know, never said he would accept it. And I don't know how Dapperton even feels about this other guy who spread his own docs around being involved in it either. So Dapperton's sort of like this innocent third party that's just been implicated in shit.
although I remember seeing the video. It's just showing how illogical esoteric actions was.
Yeah, he like the other videos he made. It's like, it's all damage control. It's all just attacking leftists for the sake of attacking leftists, which I'm not into anymore because I think I'm more interested in learning about leftist ideology because I think I'm not into rejecting ideologies wholesale anymore. Like I don't reject communism outright, especially because I'm getting into Zizek more and more. I don't reject liberalism outright because although I've grown less and less, uh, I like it less and less, and because I dislike the results it's brought, and I'm just starting to get into like fascist literature and stuff like that. So I'm not into rejecting ideologies wholesale, and I'm not into just trying to defame people and things like that for the sake of like rejecting things. Like I want to have the conversation and I want to learn. So either I can bolster my own position or change it if it's wrong. And I don't think Esso realizes that that's what more people want.
Yeah, just it's always good to talk to people that you might disagree with. Like
Mm.
it's always good to do that. It's not good to put yourself in the echo chamber and able to think you figure out all their points. You know, I've been trying to get into more proprietarian thoughts. Got like do little tries on my channel now. I just sort of just realized
Yeah.
with his framework, I just sort of realized how worthless the left is. Like all this universalism, all this liberalism in a certain extent. And I think now what I want as my goal is to definitely form a nation state. That's the only way that I know of that libertarians can achieve that type of autonomy, that type of agency that they want, that they argue for all the time. I think that's the only way they can really achieve that. Like, I think it's worth achieving um, that type of aristocratic rule like the English had, or the middle
Yeah.
class like America pyramid.
I think the proprietarian frame set is a bit of a roundabout way of trying to achieve what absolutism is looking to achieve because I think it's still sort of metaphysically speaking, baseless because at least when you had Lockean liberalism, it had its basis in God being the one who preordains our rights and that we have these natural rights from him as his creations. I look at Doolittle and I look at his theory of uh, what's it? It starts with a C, like mutual. It's like it's not correspondence. It's like a cooperation or reciprocity. I don't know why I said it. Start reciprocity. I look at reciprocity and I try to think if what makes something a right or if what makes something worth defending is if it's reciprocal or if reciprocity is the basis on which society is built, then you could simply destroy society by not being reciprocal. Like if you're someone who has a might makes right mindset and you're the strongest person in the land, then you don't give a fuck about reciprocity. You can take it all for you anyway. That's sort of the mindset of like the Genghis Khan or like the Attila the Hun type thing. You can just go around, conquer it all, and it is yours. But if you were to say, uh, that's all you really need to do. You need to stop. If you stop reciprocating, it's no longer based in anything real and concrete. But if you're starting from a standpoint of, well, the real and the concrete is God, and this is what we're going to be basing our political principles on, which is sort of like the absolutism of the old kings of Europe, then you have a much more solid basis. And I think that's sort of he's trying to secularize absolutism, and I don't think it works. Like I haven't read too much on absolutism. I like it because of what people like Dylan have told me, and what people like the Pakistani reactionary tell me. But it seems whenever I see the secularization of something that's desperate, that lacks a basis in something real, and it's just trying to build its basis out of human constructs, I see room for a diversion into something that's evil, into something that's not going to be based on natural law or anything like that. And it's just going to lead to eventually to back to what we have now. Because if you try to secularize it and you try to take the holy and the sacred away from it, or if you try to make the holy and the sacred something that isn't beyond human reach and is something that's not corruptible by humans, you're going to eventually come back to where we are now.
I don't know, like with Doolittle, like on reciprocity, it just, I think he's just extending. I think he's making Hoppe's argument much more coherently, like that fiscal removal kind of thing. When people, not when people are communists, leftists, whatever, you get kicked out from the community covenant, whatever. With Doolittle, he's expanding it how people act and behave in groups. That he's basically saying that we want to share the cost of reciprocity, while libertarians don't want to share the cost, or Rothbardian libertinism.
Yeah, so I get that.
He's more so analyzing how people act. This is why he really likes Hoppe so much, because he came the closest to that.
Yeah, no, I get what you're trying to say. Like, you're trying to get people to understand that the commons is a thing and that there's going to be a communally owned culture, essentially. And depending on what that culture is, you have it's going to make or break your society, and you all have a stake in it. And everybody needs to understand that the state is just the outgrowth of this communally grown culture and this communally sort of appreciated collective of thoughts and way of living. And, in order for that to continue, people need to respect it. But what Kurt's outright theory of reciprocity lacks, well, I agree it's an accurate analysis of what society is built on and what it needs to be built on in order to be functional. It lacks a reason why it should be that way. Like, if you say, this is the same art problem I have with sort of Harris and his ethics, and the ethics that his followers espouse. Like, it's humanism, but like, why be a humanist? why say, all right, high standards of living is a good thing? All right, why say capitalism is a good thing? Why say human flourishing is a good thing? It's all these implicit assumptions about these things being good and necessary. Like, why should we have a society based on common law or laws at all in general? Like, why should we have hierarchical structures within government? Why should we have all these different things that are presumed as good? And I think Kurtz and people who try to base this belief on anything other than, well, some supernatural force. Well, this is a crude interpretation, and I'm sort of strawmanning myself here, but to put it bluntly, if you try to base it on something other than, well, this supernatural force ordained it as such, it's going to be more easily corruptible than to say if you rest control in the hands of something external to humanity. It's going to be less corruptible than an institution that is designed and only monitored by humans. Like, if you put this idea in people's head that there is an objective right and wrong, regardless of what they do or how they act, and that they are just actors in this world, then they're going to behave a little bit better, at least to some extent, or no, to a large extent. And we can observe this in the social sciences that religious people are often the more law-abiding citizens. They are indeed the people who give more to charity as a percentage of their income. They self-report happier. Like, we know people are going to just behave better. Whereas if you try to say, well, oh, just be good to people because don't be an ass, or just be good to people because you'd want to be treated the same way, all of that's susceptible to, well, no, I'm better than people, so I'm going to take more, and I don't give a shit if I give back. That's what's lacking in the libertarian ethic. That's what uh, Doolittle is railing against when he talks about libertarians not accepting costs. It's this sort of might makes right survival of the fittest attitude. But even though I don't necessarily disagree with that attitude, if you don't explain why some level of natural selection and some level of sharing the costs are beneficial, and why the two need moderation in order to have a functioning society, if your argument is just, well, it's good for us, and there's no greater reasoning, metaphysical reasoning as to why, your society is going to kind of fall apart.
You get caught in the is alt gap thing. Um,
Yeah, it is. You get caught in the is-ought gap because talk about you can't talk about what ought to be by using what is. And I mean, you have to talk about it from other reasons, like, or at least what physically is, because God is, and we talk about what ought to be from his is, but that's not materialism, and it's not idealism either. Although I don't know what ethics you can necessarily derive from an idealist metaphysic. I'm still reading Hegel, so I still need to look more into it. But it's not this idea of reciprocity for the sake of human development, because you're still left with the question: why is human flourishing and human development good?
just
And so,
He's with Doolittle case, he's more of an analytic philosopher. He's more of that. He's not like a prescriptive philosopher like someone like Hans Hoppe or Rothbard. Like, he's just saying I think he's taking more like a more pragmatic approach to this, like ignoring the is off gap, but that's kind of thing.
yeah, well, that's the thing. That's why I think sort of the absolutism espoused by like atheistic people, or the propertarianism or libertarianism or secular liberalism. I think all these ideologies that are espoused without some notion of a divine that isn't of human making is going to be fundamentally flawed and is going to be susceptible to the same against. Like, liberals will say, well, we're happy with the illiberal outcomes of society today, but they don't realize that those are what happens when you refuse to accept some authority from the divine and accept an objective moral structure. And this Kurt's sort of propertarianism being sort of a derivative of both absolutism and a kind of Lockean liberalism is susceptible to the same thing. So even if I agree with Kurt in his description of society and his analytical breakdown of it, to implement his proscriptions without a greater metaphysical basis is going to lead to the same thing that we have today. It's just like turning the clock back to the 50s. Like, you're still going to get, 2010 and 2020 and all the degeneracy, political discontent that's come with. You just managed to send us back a bit. You have to build something from the ruins in order to keep moving forward. You can never actually turn the clock back, and that's what I still see people vaguely attempting to do.
Just, I agree with you. Just, it's just that I think we can move upon this. Like as Doolittle said, we created a monopoly government. He doesn't really like monopoly. He totally agreed with the Austrians on top of that we create a monopoly government. And I think what he wants is a monarchic aristocratic rule with multiple houses to take care of these types of things, these type of responsibilities for society. Like not like it's not like a monopoly as the U.S. government or the UK is trying to do. Just more of a, as I call it, me personally, a balance of power, or more accurately, a division of power. To do
Yeah, like I see what you're saying, and that's sort of what, when Hegel spoke of his organic society or organic community, I forget the exact wording, but he sort of speaks of it in a similar way, where it's like a sort of dispersion of power in order so that the needs of the community are unified with that of their higher ups, and that is all in accordance with the will of nature. Like, that's Hegel's perfect society, and I happen to agree with him. And I think to some extent that's what we're all trying to achieve, but largely that's not achievable without some higher metaphysical basis. Like, Hegel had idealism, and his whole thing was that we're all striving to get to know the absolute, and the absolute is what we all want to strive to be in unison with, because it's the universe and we're all really just different dividends of the universe. We just don't know it. And so in order to get to know it, we have to be able to be, we have to all have our wills in unison and things like that. And I think certain anarchists think the same way, both more lefty than right-wing anarchists. And I think the left-wing anarchists are actually sort of right in it, but I think their construction of how we achieve that structure are wildly off. But that's a different discussion. And I think what Kurt's proposing is sort of, again, it's not a bad idea, and it's not an inaccurate description or a wrong description of how society works. But by leaving a void where justification should be, where the ought comes from, you leave yourself open to the same follies that your predecessors have made.
Mm.
Like, one of the things you can't do, like, maybe on an individual level, you can become an Ubermensch, and you're able to inject meaning into your own life, and maybe that does it for you. You set your own standard, and you try to impose it on the rest of the world, and you might be able to do that for a certain amount of time. You might even be able to become king for a certain amount of time, but you're only going to become the despot king, or you're only going to become your own despot. And eventually, you're either going to become disillusioned with the own standard you've set for yourself, or if you actually manage to make it the rule of the law, your people are going to become disillusioned with it, and they're going to question you, because you're just man, and everything we know is just man. And unless we make things greater than man, and unless we set that standard above them as the objective right and the objective higher good that is above man and untouchable by man and has nothing to do with his existence whatsoever, then we set ourselves up for the same folly. It's like secularism is the beast that eats all. And no matter how correct your description of how society is or how it ought to function, you're never really going to be able to escape the fact that people are fallible. You don't have the perfectibility of man is a myth. Like, we can keep getting better and better, but you're never going to be perfect. And if you don't account for that constant imperfection, you're always going to be off.
That's true. That's exactly right. It's just, I think focusing focusing what is the perfect society is not going to get people nowhere. Like people and cats or reactionary fascists can talk about their dream society, how it's going to be traditionally is, how it's going to be how free it is, how people can do what they want. I think it just need. I think for any society, for any, if you're going to build a society, a long-lasting society, such as a nation state or civilization or empire, you're definitely going to need for its people in position of responsibility, as you're trying to get at least I think you are anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's inevitable, but I blame Protestantism. I blame it all.
Yeah, I think you're just a Catholic.
Well, it's fine. Protestantism was the birth of relativism, or it's just like it started out as like, oh, you can just interpret the Bible how you want. You don't need to be guided by the Holy Spirit or have an official teaching authority or just translate it yourself or whatever, man. And it's like fucking. That's where it went off because the thing about the Bible is it's a set of objective morals and codes, and it's not up to interpretation. Otherwise, it loses that objective moral status. And the thing I'm talking about of that secularization where you lose it, where objective moral status becomes something reliant on other contingent or subjective things, or morals are just declared subjective entirely, is because of Protestantism. The most accurate phrase one could possibly utter is that Protestantism and its effects have been a disaster for the human race. If I'm gonna paraphrase Papa Ted for a little bit, but honest to God, Protestants caused relativism and they caused secularism, and they are the cause of the current philosophical downward spiral we are in. I don't care how they try to get out of it, and I think that everything I just railed against is their fault, and I will. You cannot convince me otherwise.
I don't know, man. I don't know. It just seemed like I'm just gonna blame, like the church for failing this. I'm a Christian. I'm just gonna blame the church for failing or preserving traditions a little bit. I just think everybody got a responsibility for the failure of Western civilization, which is like the best civilization that anyone can get.
Well, I mean, I agree. The Catholic Church isn't without blame. We sort of rested on our laurels for a certain period of time and got comfortable, and we sort of allowed the Protestant Reformation to happen because because of the corruptibility of man, there are certain people within the church who got fat and happy, and they went off the good path, undoubtedly. And there's a portion that of me, and I think of all Catholics, that say, well, the Protestants weren't inherently wrong in what they wanted, which was a better, more religiously focused church, because the church had become somewhat materialistic during the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. But their way of going about trying to achieve that was just dog shit stupid. And so it's like, I get what they wanted, but how they went about doing it was just so utterly wrong. And you can't separate the two, unfortunately. You can't separate the Protestant desire for reform and how they went about doing it. They think the two are inextricably linked. So the only solution is just no Protestantism, unfortunately.
Or I don't know, just something.
We either have to convert them or outbreed them. That's like the only two options we have as Catholics if we want to restore a stable world order.
I don't know, like some type of, I don't know. I kind of like Anglo laws. I kind of like them, kind of like the Protestant laws that sort of just created the foundation for the country that I live in.
That's fucking.
I don't.
We're gonna disagree on there, but it's all gonna be fucking.
Yeah.
It's gonna be liberalism is the gay.
By no means, I'm not a Catholic. I don't really, I really like the Catholic Church, or more specifically, I really like the philosophy of the Catholics, because I think it's like one of the most rigorous Christian philosophies I ever seen. But I'm not gonna convert. That mostly due to family reasons.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you can be sort of a high church high church Anglicanism and certain strains of Lutheranism, I think, that maintain more of a Catholic tradition are all right, but I still think they're essentially, in essence, like, it comes down to what your goal for society is. If your goal for society is just high material standard of living, then you can get that. You just can't complain about the philosophical void you leave in in the collective soul of humanity. Like, that's going to be the consequence. If you're looking for if you're looking for something like actual fulfillment and achievement, you're going to have to accept the fact that that's not achieved necessarily through a incredibly high standard of living. Not that the two are necessarily opposed to each other. Again, the rich person can enter heaven as the camel can pass through the eye of the needle, but through God all things are possible. And so I don't dispel the two, but it seems like if you want to live a philosophically fulfilled life, that the current liberal global hegemon that we currently have is not the best way to do it. And you're going to have to sacrifice some material gains in order to actually feel fulfilled.
Yeah, I agree with that. More on one last topic. Let's talk about domestic policy. Right now, the hottest topic is immigration again. About the separation of children, and Trump signed an executive order to stop this. Honestly, I'm just kind of just enjoying the liberal tears from my mug right now.
Nice.
But any thoughts on this? Like, any thoughts on this immigration kind of thing, or just this mess?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because we actually have somebody in chat who asked me, Nicholas the Great, so would I support more Mexican immigration to bring up the Catholic population? My answer to that is no, but let me explain, because I don't want it to seem just outright hypocritical, like it's a racial thing. Although some of it is a racial thing, but Mexicans, I would say, and Hispanics in general, at least from the third world, I can't speak to Iberians, although I know Iberians really aren't great Catholics either, but their offspring, Iberian offspring, are even worse Catholics than they are, because they're really just Catholics in name, and that's it. Like, Mexican, like, the amounts of crime and illicit sex that go on within Hispanic communities, be it drug or prostitution related, and what they do to the children, none of that is actually Catholic. Like, yeah, I get every Catholic mom has like that, prayer candle with the Virgin Mary on it, and they got statues of the Virgin Mary out in front of their lawns like the Italians do and stuff, but they're not good Catholics, really. Like, that's the same mom who was going out partying because she looked great, and then after she rode the cock carousel has now like 3 Jose's running around to like raise, and she's trying to raise them good Catholics and telling them, oh, do as I say, not as I do, but how often does that work, really? So I am not opposed to mass immigration, even if it were for the purpose of bringing up the Catholic population, because the third world does not breed good Catholics. And furthermore, I think Trump should have kept separating the families, because I think it was good deterrent. I don't think it was actually inhumane at all. I don't care what the fucking Jesuits have to say about it. And he's whatchamacallit, the executive order wasn't too bad. All it does is unite the families in detention centers now, so it's like, it's whatever. But I would have liked to have seen him stay strong on this one for once, because he always sort of caves. He doesn't really cave, because he's still putting them in detention centers and whatever. And so, it's all still good. But he always gives the appearance of having caved a little bit, like, oh, he's not separating families anymore. And all that does is, it doesn't appease the left, and it just pisses off his really hardline supporters. So, and his hardline supporters happen to be the one with the most media attention. And so it's like, it's just not a good look whenever he tries to appease the left. And so I wish he'd stop doing it, pretty much.
just on this immigration border things. Eh, can we just close the borders? I'm tired of having this open borders debates. We live in the world of nation states and different civilizations, and right now I think Samuel Huntington is kind of right that we're storing in a clash due to these great differences. So can we just, limit immigrations from the third world? And me personally, I have no problem with Mexican immigration, but third world immigrants with poor education, low IQs, inbreeding, that's
Yeah,
just a no.
yeah, it's all pretty much just a farce. And like I would be in favor of shutting down all immigration for a certain period of time, honestly. But that's not going to happen. So I'm content with just closing our borders to the third world because I think that's a much more reasonable. It's a more reasonable position and it's more achievable, quite honestly. But
Although,
we can't. Another thing we need to do is open up our borders, at least to some extent. I think to Europeans again more broadly. Like I think we need to start selecting. I think we need racial quotas again, like we used to have pre 1965. But of course, we don't want the lefty French revolutionary students coming over. But I think we can select for people who would be ostensibly right wing through other things. Like I think we could build a test for citizenship that would essentially weed out people with personality traits that would make them prone to leftism and things like that. And I think we could essentially find a way to get just the right wing European immigrants and sort of rebuild the pan-European project that America was supposed to be.
although before the Immigration Act of 1965, I was Russian, even with restricted immigration, that the American, due to the melting pot,
Say
to
that
be a
again.
Christian, encourage
You're,
you to be a what?
you're just breaking up a little bit.
The weather is kind of sucky right now. But just encourage you, basically encourage you to get life, be part of the American national civic life, valuable experiment. You know.
Hold up. Sorry, you just
Did I cut out?
yeah, you cut out again a little bit. I don't know if it's my internet or yours, but something's up a bit.
It's just I think the boomers coming from plugging us with bad internet.
The boomers are shutting us down. Ah, fuck. Hold on. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. Oh, I think Americans are willing to accept that, man. Accept the pinkos in California.
Yeah, I think Americans are kind of apathetic when it comes to their political and ethnic fate, which is sort of a bummer, but sometimes it is what it is.
Well, I don't know. America is just like we are Americans, sort of like despite your color, despite your ethnic background, like it's just sort of just like encourage that
Well,
we
I
are
mean,
Americans, and they also encourage you to just basically abandon your culture background and just assimilate to the American civic life, essentially.
yeah, I mean, the white ones are like that at least because they're the ones who America was really designed for. Everybody else says like, oh, they're Mexican American or they're Jewish American or they're some hyphenated American, and so it sort of destroys what the project was initially supposed to be. But the project was initially never intended for the people who are using those hyphens anyway, and so it's like I think Americans are just apathetic because you can. I think it's circus and bread. Not that I don't think circus and bread are necessary for any nation. I just happen to think it's being used unhealthily in this instance because I think Americans have become bloated on their high living standards and the work they kind of did. Not it's like America is sort of resting on its laurels here, and they don't realize what it took to get them there, which was like, a European work ethic and a strong cultural unity that was, even in the even when the colonies were majority British, when other immigrants started to show up from Western Europe, there was still a common cultural identity. Like you got people like Marquis de Lafayette, who was obviously an aristocrat, which made it easier to blend in for him too. But people of like the sort of greater colonial expanse, be they Spanish, French, English, even the Germans and the Nordic immigrants, all of those people were able to really come together and form a cohesive identity and able to build a nation off of that. But that's we pretty much everyone's forgotten that, so it's rather sad to see.
The sad thing is, one of the founding fathers, I believe, James Madison, actually argued for that America should accommodate for diversity. Well, I think James Madison was also thinking about more so Europeans, like people that are coming from a more low trust polity from Europe, like
Yeah,
Europe, some parts of England, or as in that, or back then Great Britain. Like he sort of just argued that for the justification for the Constitution, while the Anti-Federalists argue that this will kind of just lead to a soft brand of authoritarianism. I think that's the main argument being summarized.
yeah,
Yeah. I guess James Madison was pretty weak on that. None of the founding fathers not a big fan of immigration
yeah.
at all. I
Well,
think they
none of the founding fathers could have possibly predicted like the hell of a predicament we've sort of worked ourselves into. So it's not like I blame him entirely.
because you can blame him for weakening the national identity.
Well, I don't think. Yeah, well, he sort of awoke a national identity. Like the Louisiana Purchase was a big deal. Manifest Destiny was a big deal. We were able to have that cohesive identity when we were constantly and openly expansionist. Like that's another thing. I think America is doing. I think America does empire wrong because I don't think what you call it. I don't think they concisely go about pacifying people, and they don't concisely go about exerting their hard power effectively. Like soft power, we can do pretty well, but hard power, we've we stopped being good at it after the Cold War ended, and even during the Cold War, it was always sort of a wish-wash, and I blame American leftists for that somewhat, but
I'm just gonna blame liberalism for causing this mess that we're in, like the one that ruined U.S. foreign policy.
well, I mean that's true and it's not true, but I think we can again. I blame the Protestants, but
I just despise any kind of leftism,
mm.
including some strand of anarchism too.
Yeah, no, of course. Like left anarchism, left anarchism is always going to be a mystery to me because the things they describe or that they say they want, I don't see being done without the formation of a state. And Zizek has the same critique of them. Like the structures they're talking about, Zizek is very much to leftism what Kurt Doolittle is to the right. Funnily enough, they both have a speech impediment, and they're both not quite all with it up there. But so a
Oh,
debate between them would
they're
what?
both rather boring speakers, and they just struggle to speak.
Yeah, I mean that's some of it, but it's like they both have like these very esoteric and practical ideals about what their uh, side of the spectrum ought to be doing at this point in time, but it's a matter of enough people realistically like assuaging. I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying. It's a matter of enough people actually buying into it. Like it's enough. It's a matter of enough leftists buying into Zizek's ideas. It's a matter of enough right wingers buying into what Doolittle's selling, and in neither case do I see enough of that happening. Because I wouldn't mind the rise of, or at least I would be more amicable to the rise of a Zizekian type left than I would be to a a Noam Chomsky sort of left, or a uh, I'm trying to think of someone else because I'm not saying like I don't mind. I haven't read enough Foucault to know if I'm like what I'm against about him or not, but uh, I just don't see it happening though. Like that's the thing. I foresee. I just see apathy on both sides of the spectrum, so there won't really be any massive agitation for change one way or another.
Hey, at
I think
least
I just see competing factions of incrementalists who some are better than others. It's like in competing factions of incrementalism between right liberalism and left liberalism just happens to be doing better at this point in time.
yeah. Hey, at least Zizek is like a living meme. Just
But he's cool. Like I like listening to him give speeches, and I've watched one of my movies with friends of mine. What's it? Pervert's Guide to Ideology, which was a very funny movie, and I love the ideology memes. I love all that. But no, Zizek is actually like a proper intellectual powerhouse, and so like I look forward to what he has to offer to discourse. I can't say that about Noam Chomsky or a lot of left anarchism, even some of like the leftism that's sort of like even like the more so to speak degenerate left, which is usually more the liberal left as opposed to the real left itself. But like Zizek very much seems to be in opposition to that, and he seems to have a very real grasp on what capitalism is as a system. Even if I don't think he's necessarily describing it in the most accurate terms, or if he's describing it as accurately as possible, I think he recognizes the beast that it is. And I think too many people on the right have been sort of duped into thinking capitalism can only be good and that it's not a destructive force, it's only a creative force, when in reality it's the greatest destructive force we've known in the whole of human history.
yeah, even Schumpeter, the he's not really Austrian economist, but yeah,
No, I know what you're talking about.
Schumpeter did recognize that, you know, that fact about capitalism. He did in fact recognize that. Like he's one of the few more honest economists about that. You don't get that. You don't get that type of reality from economists like Ludwig von Mises or Murray Rothbard or even Hans Hoppe. Like,
Yeah.
or
It's
partly because they both kind of, partly because Rothbard and Hoppe and Mises always operate in a perfect free market. Like, like as a framework, the correct theology,
yeah, their starting position was bastardized Kantian ethics. I once had a Keynesian friend of mine tell that actually, and I didn't fully grasp what it meant until I looked into Kant, until I looked into the categorical imperative a bit more. But it is just bastardized Kantian ethics, and
yeah,
I think that's a what's up.
Yeah, they are. It is it is based on Kantian axioms anyway, because because Rothbard, Mises, and Hopper were trained by Kantian people. Well, Hoppe is
it's a fetishization of both non-contradiction and consistency, when in reality those two things, like you can have consistency and still not come to libertarian principles. You can have non-contradiction and still come to libertarian principles. And even if you didn't embrace and even if you chose not to embrace non-contradiction, you could still come to libertarian principles. Like, there's so many roads, philosophically speaking, that you can choose to take and wind up being a libertarian. It's almost pointless to fetishize the things that praxeology does. And I think when we were still doing more over philosophy with like Dylan and Dusty, I think looking back on it more and more, they were right. The praxeologist doesn't really tell you anything about the world, or at least he doesn't make any prescriptive statements about the or no, I'm sorry, not that he doesn't tell you about the world, but he doesn't go from the known to the unknown. He just tells you about the state of the world and how things sit without actually giving prescriptions and without actually being able to determine a path or determine new knowledge. Praxeology is just the description of a static world in the form of a singular philosophical view with the fetishization of a one axiom in particular.
Also, I heard you getting really into to new Keynesian economics. Any commentary on that?
Say that again. Sorry.
I heard you getting into new Keynesian economics. Any commentary about that? About
Oh,
new?
I mean, I've just been reading Stiglitz and Menechue and Bernanke a little bit more. And originally, I blew through like five or not even five. It was like 8 or 10 papers in the course of like 2 or 3 weeks in order to try to make a video on why the central banks losing influence is actually a bad thing. But then I got caught up with other stuff and I totally forgot about it. I still have the papers highlighted, and maybe I'll go over some of them on stream before I actually try to formulate a video, although it's not as fresh in my mind now, so I'd have to refresh myself on what I was going to say.
Uh,
But yeah, like Keynesian theory on banking isn't as fucked as Austrians like to make it out to be.
it
And at
just,
the same time, what's up?
I'm just saying, like with Austrians, they're just more so attacking like classical Keynesianism, not really like the updated stuff. And I try to see them debate about this with actual, well, with some
Well, like,
Keynesians, but they just do terrible, honestly.
yeah, like the debate with Keynesians is always about theory, and that's the problem. Keynesianism stopped being about theory in Keynesianism stopped being theory after the Great Depression. Like it just was, and there was empirics behind it. And there's empirical backing for aggregate demand and aggregate supply and how the two curves interact. And there's empirical backing for the fact that you can indeed boost aggregate output by redirecting resources, and you can move these things. The question is whether or not it achieves Pareto optimality, and there's empirical evidence both ways about that, sort of. But like, and of course, there's the big issue with banking. So there's like so much that's the theory of Keynesianism, and that theory on all these different fronts ignores. And Austrians just don't do it. Like, I don't agree with the notion that Austrians are anti-empirical, because I think that's a straw man largely. But Austrians choose not to delve into that, and it makes me annoyed because they could so easily. I think there's plenty of evidence to support that the notion that the free market is more efficient in a lot of ways, but it's only on very certain areas where I disagree on that area, like when it comes to free banking per se, or full reserve versus fractional reserve, commodity versus fiat, things like that. That debate requires more technical nuance. And again, that's something else where Austrians lack because it relies on empirical data. And so, like, if Austrians continue to just choose to debate theory, they're going to keep losing. And that
So
sucks because I think they do have something to offer economics, but just not the way they're doing it right now.
I think Hayek, I think the Hayekian branch of the Austrian school is definitely more willing to dive in empirics because they more so focus about information, knowledge, or the dispersal of knowledge in the free markets. Like they're
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's gonna if there's gonna be a branch of Austrianism that's gonna make its appearance soon, it's going to be the Hayekian school, and it's going to be people like Selgin and stuff. Like I just watched the Selgin Murphy debate finally, And undoubtedly, I think Selgin came out on top because I think Murphy was arguing a philosophical debate and Selgin was arguing one of empirics and uh, matter of fact reality. And I think that's why, and I think that's a pretty good summary of why Austrians keep on losing. It's a philosophical argument for them, and that's why I think people like Shane Killian and Dapperton aren't going anywhere because it's always philosophy for them. It's never actually what's happening in the real world. It's only abstractions, and that's why I think they're losing so much relevance. That's why I think Austrians are going to lose relevance, and that's why I think liberalism and the secular right in general is going to lose a lot of steam because it's all abstractions. It's none of it deals in reality and the fact of the matter, but that's a whole bunch of different topics.
It's just that I don't know. I kind of like what Doolittle was trying to do, trying to reform Wall Street economics, like refuting people like Hoppe Rothbard or the lunatic fringe that he's put in, trying to restate praxeology into, as he called it, a scientific praxeology with Poppian or Karl Popper falsification kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of that, but I don't think it's secularized. It's going to fail. It's like, I don't know. I've been saying it this whole stream. If you're going to secularize your system of beliefs, it's going to fail because humans are fallible and dumb, and you shouldn't let them control too much.
Well, except of course, except their private things.
Except like, what now?
If I have except in private matters, you know.
Well, yeah, it's like, all right. So here's the thing. I think sometimes people are better at understanding their own material needs, but I put it with the caveat of sometimes because I'm slowly losing confidence in like this sort of not homo economicus, but this idea that people just sort of know, you know, even in terms of material things. Because I think human fallibility doesn't simply extend to philosophical or spiritual matters or matters of the mind and perception in general. I think it's just a matter of the physical and like the body as well. It's like I don't think anything human is to be trusted, quite honestly. And you know, that's the problem with government too, because if men were angels, there would be no need for government, and if men were governed by angels, then there would be no need for worry. But being that the task is to govern man, there is much to. I'm paraphrasing a quote badly, but you get the idea. And so I think we have. What?
I was about to say that James Madison quote.
Oh, is it James Madison?
Yeah, from the Federalist.
Yeah, it's like. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's the point. And I think democracy was a step in the wrong direction, but I don't know what's forward. I can envision a world radically different from it is now. How we get to it, I'm still unsure, but that's the trouble, isn't it now?
Well, let's see. Civilizational.
There's guys like us who LARP about theory on live streams like this. That's what we get.
Let's see how they move forward. Civilizational collapse.
Will it collapse?
Yeah, just or like let the system fall. So I kind of like the part, but I'm kind of like how the evils of democracy is unraveling every day. So
yeah,
so they all come apart.
Well, we really just have to see. Tis a matter of time.
Time is always an enemy, right? Mm. Okay, I think I'm gonna end the stream here. I hope everybody enjoyed a good weekend. Thanks, Pragmatic Culture or Joe, for coming in to talk to me on my channel again.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, peace out, and Wakanda forever. Goodbye.